Good evening. On behalf of the county, Kane and Associates and DPZ Co-Design, welcome to the last meeting of Series 2 of 3. My name is Marina Corey with DPZ, and I'm joined by Matt Lambert and Mike Wyke. From Kane and Associates, we have Eliza Giuliano with us, as well as many more from county, including Alberto, Olin, Greg, and Marcos. All these folks will be helping to answer the questions during the 2 Q&A pauses we have. As a reminder, Series 1 was an introduction to the comprehensive plan and the particularities of each of the 6 market areas. It provided detailed references about each area of the county to assist us all in better celebrating the general character and individuality of each area. It also touched on strategies for growth based on what areas in each market area will generally be maintained and preserved, what areas will evolve, what areas will transform, and what areas can grow. As a follow-up, this series is an introduction to sectors and place types, 2 technical terms you will learn about today, and they are intended to further define how to guide growth in a more predictable manner and in a way that supports the mayor's initiatives and what we are hearing many county residents and commissioners want and support. Series 3, in late spring or at the end of this month or soon thereafter, will be about the zoning code, and will describe the zoning regulations in detail intended to support the policies and the place types that we're going to be showing you today to help guide growth development, and as well as those areas that need to be conserved. So we look forward to your active participation, collaboration, and engagement with this team as we collectively map and describe the ways in which the county should grow over the next few decades and what that growth can look like. A few quick housekeeping rules before we begin the presentation. This meeting is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Vision 2050 website that's indicated here. It's also being streamed live to the Orange County social media. We encourage you to ask questions through Zoom using the Q&A button and or through the Orange County Facebook with a live stream comment, and we will be answering as many as we can during this session. Additional surveys. We encourage you to stay on and take this short survey for those of you who are on Zoom after this meeting because it's going to help us refine the work as we move forward. And when this meeting ends, a link of this presentation will also be posted on the Orange County Facebook page. So on that note, I would like to turn the presentation over to Alberto Vargas, the Planning Director, who will make some welcoming remarks before turning it over to Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina, and welcome everyone. I am very excited to be here and spend the next hour or so with everyone, where we're going to be discussing quite a bit of information in direct relationship to this Vision 2050 as we continue to embark in an engaged discussion about the planning of the future growth in Orange County for the next 30 years. It is a slightly different way of planning, for sure, a different way than we have been planning for the last 30 years, in the sense that we're taking the context of Orange County as the foundation of this ongoing formulation of the strategies. The diversity that exists in Orange County is extremely important, from lifestyles to development trends to topographic conditions throughout the county are beginning to drive specific context-based decisions in which the policies are going to be slightly adjusted in order to identify areas for targeted growth or preservation, as well as preservation of those neighborhoods that are pretty much built out. We started this conversation back in December of last year, where we focused on a macro scale type of understanding of the county by market areas. There are 6 market areas in the county, and we've shared with you quite a bit of data regarding socioeconomic conditions, historical conditions, as well as statistical analysis of those areas in particular. This is the last market area that we would be discussing out of this second series of meetings. We've started this second series back in in March of the 22nd of this year, and went all the way through the county, engaging those residents that live in those specific market areas to discuss in detail specific scenarios about sectors, which is the next level of planning, which to us, it means pretty much the vision mapping, understanding those general boundaries of areas that delineate the county's reference to policies as to how they are going to develop, redevelop, or pretty much stay largely the same within the planning horizon. And then we'll also tonight, as you learn more from Matt Lambert's presentation, we're going to talk a little bit more about place types, which is a new nomenclature for future land uses in the county. No longer looking at a parcel-based type of land uses, but looking at places, an association of different land uses that define the character of different places, the mix of uses that may be allowed within those places, the streets and open spaces that are part and well integrated into the character of those experiences of our neighborhoods and communities, and the level of densities, of course, and intensities that that define those places as well. So looking forward to tonight. I don't want to delay the rest of the information, and we're interested in your participation. Please stay connected. There is the Vision 2050 webpage displayed on the screen. Please take your time on spending a little bit of time. If you have not participated in the last several meetings, there's quite a bit of information there, from videos to surveys, and of course the timeline of how long this process will take until we go through the public hearings. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Lambert. Thank you, Matt.
All right, thanks, Alberto. Well, in the last series, as Alberto mentioned, there's a lot of complex topics that were addressed, many listed here to frame the importance of a comprehensive plan, because really most people don't interact with a comprehensive plan. Many don't know what it is. Those of us who deal with policy and planning, we know quite a lot about it, but it is an important piece of future policy that everybody should be familiar with, and it should be approachable. Many topics were covered in the last meeting series, and it's important to go back and view those series 1 town halls to get some background in addition to what we're seeing today and future meetings that we'll have. This last time, Alberto spoke and others a lot about how much growth the county will see over the next 30 years. What are the dynamics of growth and aging and different generations? In what formats might growth occur in? What affects housing affordability? What affects people's access to transportation options? Where are places within the county that are more or less connected to regional transportation? Are there new mobility technologies to pay attention to, the current state of planning and how that's shifting, and how zoning works in relationship to a comprehensive plan? Quite a lot must be considered when developing a vision like Vision 2050 aimed at looking forward 30 years, because 30 years is quite a long time. If we jump back 30 years 6 times, you see sewing machines there, and then trains really becoming popular in 1870s and blimps and so forth. Quite a lot happens in 30 years. And this last 30 years, we've seen quite a lot, especially in terms of computers, from them not being a commonplace in a home to them being in our pocket. Technically, here's a computer on on my head right now. So where we see the next 30 years go, we don't know everything, but we know that there have been a lot of changes in planning. There's a lot of changes that are desired in policy, and comprehensive plans are designed to look forward to a distant future and to align the policies and activities of the county towards a shared future vision. Orange County, since we're talking about technology and innovation, there's a hotbed of innovation here in Orange County, but it's also home to quite a diverse and growing population. And we'll talk a lot about growth management today. And as we look at growth management, we have to consider how to grow while protecting sensitive natural lands, protecting the county's rural heritage, but also to grow in ways that increase equity and affordability, mobility options, and access to jobs and places for friends, for family, and for fun. As a reminder, the current comprehensive plan was adopted in 2009. Of course, these things have quite a lot of content, and Vision 2050 will have a lot of content as well, though hopefully in a more friendly and publicly accessible format. That way we can set clear expectations for the future, which really creates a better relationship between, say, policy and your expectations of what you'll see in your neighborhoods and your communities and in your market areas on a daily basis. Today, we're going to focus on growth and development policies and the way that Vision 2050 leads the county towards a future vision rather than being reactive to the existing conditions. A major component of growth is the projection of population. The county's been growing steadily, as you can see in this chart. The line's kind of linear. At the end, there's that little cone of uncertainty, but if you follow that linear pattern, that lands us at this roughly 690,000 people in the next 30 years. It could be higher, it could be lower, but either way, we know that growth is happening, growth is coming, and it's not something that can just be stopped. We need to talk about how to accommodate growth such that the end goals, the outcomes are supportive of the future that we're all looking towards. So again, 690,000 is quite a lot of people, a lot of new neighbors. For reference, the city of Orlando, the overall city boundary is 280,000 people. So this is about 2.5 times the population that are within the city. It's quite a lot. But to think that growth would occur evenly across the whole county, that's just bad planning. You're not going to accommodate people everywhere. And to allow growth in this form, to not really help think about and direct and set policies for where and how growth should happen, well, that's bad policy. And that would result in a degraded quality of life, increasing the time that people have to drive in their commutes or to get services on a regular basis, increasing the cost of infrastructure and the tax burden that's associated with maintaining infrastructure, and reducing the rural and natural lands. And so these are not desirable outcomes. I hope we'll all agree. And so instead, we look at planning in order to direct growth to specific places and not everywhere. One of the two components of growth management in Vision 2050 are sectors. Sectors direct growth to where it's encouraged. But we also plan in order to direct the character of new development that is in places where growth is desirable. When we consider the county as a whole, it's quite diverse, and it should continue to offer people a diversity of options for where to live, diverse job opportunities and educational choices, and diverse ways to get around. In Vision 2050, place types direct the character of future growth through form, intensity, the structure of blocks, civic spaces, which are open spaces, not just sort of dribbled around, but open spaces that are active, and then the mix of uses and mobility options that are available in different places. So the sectors are large, and place types fall within the sectors, and together these direct growth towards a future vision. Where growth occurs and the character it takes is a key component of Vision 2050. These live in the future land use component of the comprehensive plan. Sectors, again, determining where growth should occur, and place types determining the form that growth will take. And while most residents, as we said, don't directly interact with future land use in the comprehensive plan, we hope in Vision 2050 that the document is one that everyone can understand, that through this process you can contribute to the vision, and that you can build expectations for what the future will be like following these policies. There's some other terminology that we use, and we just wanted to touch on some of these items so at least you know what they are if you're not familiar. Some of these are policy, others are not necessarily policy. At the top, there's this incorporated municipalities. We'll hear that a lot throughout this, because incorporated places within the county, they determine their own goals, their own growth policies. The county coordinates with them, staff coordinates with their staff, leadership with their leadership, but the goals and policies in those areas are determined independently of the county's goals and policies. Next below that are the market areas. These were discussed in the prior meeting, and Alberto spoke about them a bit earlier, and you saw those graphics. These are really a tool that allows for us to zoom in on parts of the county that have different characteristics, to analyze those places, to engage with people who live and work there, and to consider how different policies should react to different contexts. You should also be familiar with the urban service area. It's a policy boundary that determines where utility service will be offered. Indirectly, this is a growth management policy, as it limits where growth can occur from an urban versus a rural standpoint. And then the following three elements in this list are the subjects of this and the following town hall meetings, which work together to control the intensity and the form of growth. So today we're looking at sectors and place types. In the next series, we'll look at Orange Code, which is a zoning code update, and that's very closely tied to the sectors and place types. So sectors. Remember, sectors determine where growth should occur. They also determine the amount of growth in each area through which place types are appropriate. They limit the place types that are applicable in a given area, and those are the new future land use categories that we'll get into later. We'll look at these after the sectors, and we'll take some questions on sectors beforehand. But to understand sectors, it's best to think about them determining where growth should be directed. Here are the 6 sectors in Vision 2050 on the left, and we put a little reminder on the right that incorporated areas are not included in the sectors because they manage their own growth. So at the top left is the targeted sector. This includes growth priority areas. Next is the intended sector. These are where existing area-wide plans have been developed and where existing planning developments plan developments have been approved and entitled. These 2 sectors are where nearly all the future growth is directed. Following this are the established and rural sectors. These are low growth areas aimed at retaining their current character, enhancing some things like natural trails, access to sidewalks and so forth. These areas may see a little bit of natural growth, but in general, growth is not encouraged in those areas. And then the preserved sector is for large and contiguous preserved natural areas. At the bottom is this special sector. It's a little bit strange, but it's for more complicated land uses like power plants, water treatment, airports, universities, these places that are not neighborhoods or shopping centers or mixed-use developments, but instead are places that require special consideration and special rules. So here's how this all breaks down in terms of land area. And we'll look at this in maps, so hold on for that. The vast majority of the county is within the preserved, the rural, and the established sector where significant growth is discouraged. Instead, growth is directed to the targeted and intended sectors. That's roughly 12% of the county. And in chart form, you can see it here. Just note that in the upper left, we've specified roads because road rights of way, they cover a lot of ground when you add them all up across the county. So we lump them in the incorporated areas just in terms of considering, where growth is encouraged or discouraged. Anyhow, the incorporated areas and road rights of way, they occupy quite a large amount of the county, but the preserved and rural sectors, they actually occupy a little bit more. Then areas prioritized for development, just sort of in the top right, the targeted intended sectors, these are a small percentage, that roughly 12%. So let's take a look at each sector. First, the areas where growth is discouraged, and then we'll look at the places where growth is encouraged. Here's the overall map of the county, and we'll see how sectors are mapped at the countywide level, and then we'll zoom into the Southwest Market area for a closer look. Incorporated areas cover about 24% of the county. We've labeled just a few of them here, like you don't see Windermere on there. That's just because they're for orientation, and it would be very hard to read the maps if we sort of labeled every single one of the municipalities. These areas manage their own growth priorities, and sectors apply to the unincorporated areas in between them. The first of these sectors is the preserved sector. These are lands currently in preservation or with policies directing for future preservation. The sector includes only large and contiguous areas in preservation, while many developments may have additional smaller conservation easements within them, and those might fall in different sectors. Here's the preserved sector mapped, covering about 21% of the county overall. The rural sector includes lands in agricultural use, rural settlements, large undeveloped lands where growth is discouraged, and natural areas that are not yet in preservation. Here's the rural sector mapped. Like the preserve sector, the rural sector covers about 21% of the county. Of course, a lot of this is in the rural east, but there's some here in the southwest and in the northwest as well. The established sector is next. This includes most of the county's residential areas, and the goal here again is to maintain the current character. Here's the established sector mapped. These are areas that are residential, principally surrounding and between incorporated areas. This sector includes about 13% of the county. It's a low growth area because growth may still occur. There's still 20, 30 acre properties that are within here that have entitlements today to subdivide and develop, and those will still be possible in the future. But the policies in other sectors where growth is targeted will really try to help increase the pace of growth in the targeted areas and not so much in areas like the established sector. So when you add these three together, you can clearly see that areas where growth is discouraged, comprising 55% of the county. And of course, we're excluding the incorporated areas from this because they set their own rules. So that's also a big chunk of the county. So I put it in this standpoint to sort of help us think about growth and growth allocation. Since I have a 6-year-old and I've heard her say quite often these terms related to this sort of healthy eating strategy that schools talk about today of go slow and whoa. They encourage kids to eat lots of healthy foods, the go. My head's probably on top of the carrot if you're watching on social media. But those are the sort of go foods, the go places. To not eat too many processed foods. Those are the slow places, the slow foods. And to very rarely eat sweets and treats, and those are the whoa. So we can take a look at the sector map in the same light with the whoa areas where we want to discourage growth, like the preserved and rural sectors, slow areas like the established sector, and we'll look at the go areas next. The intended sector is a go area that includes places that are already, and already means before the Vision 2050 process, already planned for new growth. This includes entitled planned developments and area-wide plans. The sector represents about 5.5% of the county and includes areas like Horizon West and Innovation Way. Since we're looking at the Southwest, a lot of this is actually in the Southwest sector, again, previously planned, previously entitled. And lastly, the targeted sector. This is where most new growth will be directed and encouraged. The sector includes existing commercial, industrial, and higher density residential land located along the county's major roadway networks and areas along its future planned transit routes. Here's the targeted sector mapped, represents about 6% of the county. The targeted sector is heavily concentrated in the I-4 corridor. That's in this market area, much of it anyhow, and the South Industrial area, which is in the South Market area directly adjacent. It also includes major roadways leading to and in between incorporated areas. Where it's mapped along major roads, the targeted sector is closely tied to future transportation planning. This is coordinating land use and transportation, which is a planning ideal that's fully embedded in Vision 2050 and Orange Code. And they're both really well connected to Florida DOT's new context standards, which support that type of transportation and land use planning in comprehensive plans and in zoning codes. Together, the intended and the targeted sectors where growth overall is encouraged, about 11.5% of the county. Then there's a special sector filling the gap, which is a small amount of the county overall. Again, places that need special attention or special rules. And altogether, we have a full sector map of the county. This map directs where growth should occur and how much should occur in a given area. And at this scale, it's hard to determine individual areas. So we'll dive into the specifics for the Southwest. But first, from a go slow and whoa approach, sectors hopefully are fairly clear from this perspective, directing where and to what extent growth should occur. So let's zoom into the Southwest market area and see how sectors are applied here. About 1/3 of the Southwest market area falls within incorporated municipalities. These places determine their own growth policies, and the county manages everything in between, the other 2/3. And of course, the county coordinates planning and policies with incorporated areas as well. Here are the preserved areas, 6% of the market area, mainly between the lakes and Shingle Creek. 15% of the market area is in the rural sector at present. Now, I'm an outsider, and I'd say a good amount of this area has already lost its rural character because the established sector and urban development has happened sort of all around it. Whether this is mapped as rural or established sector, I think is up for discussion in this mapping process. Yesterday, we had a similar discussion around some of the rural settlements in the rural east, where portions of those were much more like an extension of some of the urban development within the urban service area and not really tied to the rural character around them. Not that these areas should be intended for any change, but that they're not really rural anymore. So they may be more clearly mapped as established. This is especially true here in the South and the Southwest, including areas that have been surrounded by urban development. And residents may identify with the area as rural, though statistically the overall area is not. So today it's 15% in this map. It may go down to 15 to 8% if we account for the reality on the ground. So we'll be looking at these types of mapping changes as we prepare maps over the next few months. And we'll talk about that a few times over the evening. Here's the established sector, mostly adjacent to Orlando. Again, this could spread further west since the areas, really share the established characteristics more than rural characteristics. So that's 12% is mapped here. It could be as much as 19 as we adjust maps. But together, these areas cover another 1/3 of the market area in no and low growth standpoint. So any adjustments between the rural and established don't change the low growth paradigm, by the way. This is all really in the low growth mindset. Now with the remaining sectors, the special sector covers 2% of the market area, so it's very little. And then in the growth category, the intended sector covers 19% of the market area. That's really more than anywhere else in the county. Again, these are areas with existing area-wide plans or with planned developments that have already been entitled. Horizon West, of course, is one of these areas with a plan in place today. Growth in these areas and the phasing of that growth is outside of the growth management purview of Vision 2050. These have already been decided. They've been established and approved, and aspects of their development fall to approved PDs and regional state standards. So they exist as of the concept of Vision 2050, thus they're in the intended sector. Then finally, there's the targeted sector. This covers 12% of the market area, concentrated along the I-4 corridor. Part of a previous planning effort, the I-4 corridor is intended to become a higher intensity mixed use regional center with jobs, services, entertainment, and housing. And aside from the intended sector's approved plans, the vast majority of growth is encouraged to be within the targeted sector. In total, growth areas in Southwest market area cover the last third. Interesting, it's roughly 1/3 incorporated areas, 1/3 no and low growth areas, and 1/3 growth areas. So from a go slow woe standpoint, here's how the map kind of breaks down. Again, it's roughly 30, 30, 30 across the board. And from a sector standpoint, this is a composite sector map. So hopefully this provides a strong understanding of sectors in the Southwest market area and what they're intended to do. And we'll quickly tee up why are we using these constructs. Currently, the future land use on the right side of this image, future land use is a reaction to existing uses today. And it must be changed often. So if there's an office building that were to be converted to housing, for instance, and that may be something with the changing face of work that we'll see in the near future. At present, you'd have to change the future land use in order to do that, though it may be a goal to increase our housing affordability, increase housing units, and that's a very low impact way forward, yet you'd spend a long time in the process of changing the future land use category. And it's unstructured at present, meaning that there's really no rules, there's no structure of rules as to where one future land use or another should be located. And so as a result, it's unpredictable. So with sectors, as we've investigated just now, and place types, which we'll look at next, both of these levels of planning provide structure and rules that are aimed at a predictable outcome. These are planned at the scale of an area, not property by property, and as a result, it's possible to determine if future changes to the future land use, because they can always be requested, but the rules make it easier to determine if they make sense or not, if they should be accepted. Sectors influence place types. These establish the first structure, and place types direct zoning and built outcomes. And we'll clarify that in a little bit in the second half of this discussion tonight and in the next series. But before we move on from sectors, we'd like to see if there's any questions so far from attendees or viewers, or if the county or consultant team would like to add anything. Marina?
Thank you, Matt. There are actually two very good questions, which could lead to a whole host of others, but I'll begin with the first one, which is, why is there only 6% of preserved area in this market area? I would like to see that number higher. And I'd like to say, I mean, maybe Matt, you can distinguish between the sectors that identify natural and environmental lands, but that's not to say that there aren't parks that exist within the other sectors as well that would make that number actually higher.
Yeah, the preserved areas are really, Shingle Creek and some of the lakes and some preserved lands around them. But there's lots of additional wetlands and open spaces that have either been already preserved today, or if development were to occur in a given area, would be required to be preserved in the future, like the wetlands in particular. That also doesn't tie in necessarily to open space, because open space and civic space, as I had mentioned, are items that would be required in the future with new development, because we're looking at a sort of larger area-wide vision. But in terms of large areas of preservation, there's a lot that goes into expanding preservation and preservation policy. There's quite a lot in the county along the St. Johns River and again in Shingle Creek. But in terms of large areas of preservation, you sort of have what has already been preserved, or what can be preserved through purchase of properties and through policies. But again, as you mentioned, there's wetlands and other water bodies and systems that are preserved by state policy and federal policy as well, that don't show up on those maps because they're little pieces here and there.
Thank you. And I noticed that Olin answered and essentially said the same thing as well. So this is a question we get a lot in many different communities, which is, what are the drawbacks if we were to limit or cease population growth? Is it possible to curb growth by minimizing new housing development? I'm interested in preserving the natural land of our county rather than clearing out acres of trees and wetlands to build homes. So I think we have to first acknowledge the fact that there's this is a new way what was being proposed here is a way that's going to really minimize the destruction. There should never be a building in wetlands to begin with, but this is a more sensitive and sustainable way of developing that's being proposed here. But stopping growth is very, very hard to do, and cities are able to do it for a very short period of time. And those cities that have imposed moratoriums on development with the hopes that people stop coming suffer all sorts of other unintended consequences as a result. I mean, Orlando the general market area is a desirable place to be. People are continuing to move to Florida, so it's not reasonable to expect that the population won't grow. In fact, it's healthy to expect some level of growth. And what's happening here is that the growth is being directed to those areas that can accommodate it and welcome it. Not to say that there aren't areas that are really preserving where growth should happen. So I'm sure Matt or Alberto may want to add to that.
Well, you did pretty well there, Marina, but some of the specific unintended consequences may be helpful in the conversation. One of which is the cost of housing. So if you restrict growth and there's demand because there's a strong economy, if there's demand for that housing, then the price increases, and that reduces affordability. And we know that that housing affordability into the future is a priority of the mayor, and it should be a priority for most people. So one thing that happens if you stop growth is that prices go up. Another thing that happens if you stop growth is that eventually, while you may have a strong economy now, you can lead to an economy that tanks. You'll see businesses leave because there's not places for their employees to live. They can't expand, and you lose the innovation that really the area relies on for its robustness of economy. I mean, so those are two examples of downstream consequences, and of course there's others.
And there's one other one, which we see here when moratoriums are imposed. For example, when the school board doesn't have a school capacity, and so the moratorium is put into place until the schools can catch up. What happens is that if there were, for example, 100 homes built every month, and then there's a moratorium that stops for 3 months, what we see happening is that 300 that were technically saved come on the other end of it. So they catch up very, very quickly. So instead of 100 being built a month, it becomes 150 for the next 6 months or something to that effect. So because that population growth is sort of somewhat stable.
Well, another thing, Marina, is that, if we're looking specifically in the Southwest, some growth where there may be demand for it here, and especially as we look at the I-4 corridor being a very important growth target, if growth were to be stopped, but it may likely be allowed to the south of here. That just means that there's more people driving further on the roads all the time. So you're not really addressing issues of traffic congestion that you could otherwise if you are directing growth in, say, a manner, as we'll look at, that is intended to be more transit supportive, not necessarily transit reliant, but supportive of transit.
That's right. So what this plan is saying is acknowledging that growth will come and trying to shape it in the most appropriate way possible, and acknowledging that there are different areas that will accommodate different densities. So now shifting gears a little bit, Matt, can you describe a little more the special sectors? Someone says, I don't understand. I also want stronger protections for rural settlements. So they may or may not have been part of the yesterday there was a big discussion about the rural settlements because we were in the rural east, but maybe you can touch a little bit on the different ways in which rural settlement patterns are going to be established moving forward, and maybe a slightly greater description on the special sectors.
Yeah, and we'll look at the rural settlements. I'll touch on that first. And we'll look at that in place types a little bit in an example. But this in the Southwest market area, there's basically two types of conditions, I'd say, for rural areas and rural settlements. One is the condition where the rural settlement has been surrounded by development of a higher intensity, right? And so these are places of a lower intensity that probably want to maintain that and not see their homes demolished and 3 homes built in their place and so forth. And so there's a sort of boundary of those rural settlements, and the goal here again is preservation, and that comes a little bit down to zoning. It comes a little bit down to where the rural service boundary is, and then there's the other areas which are further west that haven't been surrounded by development and are more rural in character in general. And in those areas, we'll talk specifically about place types and what development might be allowed to occur there, if any, and what controls might be in place for that. So we'll look at that specifically in a little bit in place types, and I'm sure we'll have more conversation about it. In terms of the special sector, so over here, really it covers the golf course, and I'm sure somebody could tell me what those weird squiggly things are. But if you look elsewhere across the county, this is mapped on places like large universities that have major campus plans like UCF, airports. There are power plants and big water treatment facilities. There's the prison. There are other types of facilities like this that are not neighborhoods. They're not mixed use centers, main streets, that are not shopping centers, that are not business parks, office parks. So we lump all this stuff that is like, places of, jobs, places of entertainment, places for shopping, and places to live together into most of our categories. And then there's the special stuff, because the places that we lump together, living, jobs, and so forth, those tend to follow a limited number of patterns that codes have been normally written for. So it's sort of easy to codify those, to write policy for those areas. But other areas, like a power plant, for example, it's really much more difficult it's not a typical type of development. So you can't write rules that are sort of universal for those. So instead, you need to consider those on a case-by-case basis, which is sort of different from, say, a shopping center.
Yep, that's right. So the next two questions, I'm going to group them together because this is coming from someone who evidently values growth. Central Florida has the potential to grow and be the Beverly Hills of the East Coast, as so much money pours in here every year. So the question, it's a twofold question. Is there an intention to increase the standards of growth? And why do we have areas of growth? Why do we have areas where growth is not encouraged instead of allowing higher levels of growth, for example? And I think when you speak to the place types, there will be a greater level of detail that shows the different degrees of intensity that are encouraged in different areas, right? But you don't, as Matt showed in his population map, you don't want to encourage growth everywhere because the county does have certain areas lend themselves better to certain densities than others. So that's what that's the first level of distinction that the sectors are attempting to identify, is to encourage the directing of certain public investments, for example, along corridors, and placing housing closest to where transit may occur, and also recognizing the fact that the established sectors are areas where people live there, they like the character that surrounds them, and they don't necessarily want it to change dramatically. They want it to change a little bit. And so what would that little growth look like is what Matt's going to be describing in the next segment.
Yeah, and beyond just transit, it's that there's a lot of land uses. We talk about land use, but let's look at, say, a big shopping center that never uses more than 70% of its parking lot. That 30% is land that's essentially wasted today that could be used for other things. Business parks are sort of similar. So there are a lot of areas that we're looking at where growth can occur in an infill manner that then is really well connected, because those tend to be along the major roadways and connected to places that have bus service. And so there's priorities for infilling in these types of places and to create mixed use places there of a higher intensity. And there's, as Marina says, there's some people that are living in the existing neighborhoods and they like where they live. There's some people that live in the rural areas and that they like where they live. Where you don't have a lot of choice on are places that you could live that are walkable mixed use areas. You have downtown, you don't have much more. And there's a population that wants that type of environment as well. So it's really mostly about increasing that opportunity, and increasing that opportunity has a low impact on existing residences. And so we're looking at the opportunities for increasing that type of lifestyle, and then the way that we're not just talking towers, but the way that you have other scales of living, be it small multifamily buildings or townhouses or duplexes or smaller single family homes that may not exist today in the county and in the market, but there's a lot of opportunity to infill those on sites that are underdeveloped.
That's right. Okay, so there's now in relationship to where growth should occur, there's a question I'm actually going to ask Eliza to answer, and that is someone's asking the question: what relation, if any, does this effort have with how shall we grow, which are the 4 C's, which relate to conservation, countryside, centers, and corridors? And maybe Eliza, you can talk to that, and Alberto may want to add to it as well.
Sure. So the How Should We Grow effort was completed circa 2007. And I get a lot of questions about what happened to that. But it actually has been working its way through a lot of governments and entities in Central Florida for some time. So I was involved in implementing with Metro Plan back in the 2010 era. But I think you'll see a really strong connection as Matt moves into the next segment on place types. Specifically, centers and corridors are actually some of the place types that we're using. And then in terms of countryside, getting into the rural place types that are really starting to express that rural character in a meaningful way. And so I think you'll see a really strong connection to that as it continues to be implemented throughout the region.
Yep, it sounds like there's a real strong correlation. There's one other question which I think I'm going to read it out loud, but for the person who asked the question, it will. I want to refer them to the next part of the presentation that Matt will make, because I think it will address this, and it's a sort of an all-encompassing question. What are the plans to balance population density versus continuous sprawl with the mindset of preserving natural spaces while not causing overcongestion? So this really has to do with where and how you want to direct growth. So it's a very good question, but I hope that Matt's explanation of the place types will help provide additional context.
Although I might remind Marina that we spoke last night to those questions about growth and where should growth occur and should we want growth to occur even in the targeted sectors. And our points there were that if you want to preserve areas of rural heritage in the county, you want to preserve natural areas in the face of growth, which is inevitable as we've discussed. If you don't accommodate for that growth in these infill conditions in the targeted sector, as we'll be looking at through the place types, then what is likely to happen is that growth will impact the rural areas and the natural areas. And so it is a balance of wanting some character preservation and accommodating growth in certain areas, but then also managing where and to what extent that growth occurs, especially so that it can be livable and create places that can work on more modes of transit than everybody with just their car. Not that that's a requirement, but there are places that work for biking and work for walking and work for buses and work for trains that are of a certain format, and there's not a lot of that today. And so if we want to be efficient in transportation and we don't want that growth to cause more congestion, more lanes than necessary, then we need to look at the format that growth takes.
Okay, great. And I think the last question here before we move into place types, I'm going to direct to Alberto, which is, I think there's two questions that could somewhat be combined. Someone's talking about the fact that Horizon West has a community lifestyle guide, which includes a lot of green belts and public spaces by design. And there's a question that says, we talk about protecting the wetlands, but there's other kinds of spaces that need to be protected too. So maybe Alberto, you can speak to the protections that the comprehensive plan will provide to the environmental lands that exist that are not necessarily wetlands, to the lakes, to the green belts, to the natural parks, et cetera, that are going to be part of this effort as well.
Yeah, and I think, thank you, Marina, and thank you for the person that asked the question. I believe in terms of Horizon West, as a sector plan, it carries all of those specific policies that are very discernible for each one of the villages within Horizon West, and the diversity that exists within each one of those villages. So the policies are set. Development is extremely active because there is a higher level of predictability within the sector plan itself. And the special areas, those areas of conservation, the natural areas that exist and will continue to exist in perpetuity because they are preservation, the buffering that is layered as part of the policy when growth is intended to happen within each one of those villages, is already part of the development review process. They are required, they will continue to be part of the development program because we need those policies to be implemented when development happens. the greenways as well as the water bodies within Horizon West are part of the amenities. You know, the definition of what those villages are all about are created by the transition between the existing preserved areas and the development in the character that is happening. There may be some individuals that may be surprised in terms of the rate that development is happening, but the established process of review, as long as it reaches compatibility in nature and consistency with the policies of the comprehensive plan, it will continue to move forward at the public level of conversations, which is what happens in a public hearing, and a transmittal process when they're associated to PDs, and approval of an adoption of that particular complement amendment if it's associated with that development. So of course, it's not only about open space, it's not only about those green belts, it's not only about the water bodies, but also about the wildlife and the corridors and the links that happens between those preservation areas that are so important and are integral to the entire sector plan. I'm gonna also maybe open it up for John Geiger with EPD, who's with us today as part of this panel, to address any additional specifics that I may have missed in my response. So John.
Hello, I'm hoping, can someone verify you hear me?
Yes. We can hear you.
Yes, we have the existing Orange County regulations, which are not proposed to be changed as part of this in Chapter 15, which is environmental control. And there's Article 10 in there, which has direct processes for analysis of existing wetlands. And those wetlands also require a buffering around the edges, which also is a form of protection. So in addition to the wetlands, I saw the question earlier about that there's value in some protection of some uplands as well. And I would see that as happening in the open space approach, where certain percentages of the land that's being requested for development must remain as open space. One type of that open space is permanently undeveloped upland or green area. So we get some protection in that manner as well. I think that sheds a little bit of light. I mean, we also look at the types of wetlands, how much habitat and how much biodiversity functionality exists within each of those wetlands. That helps our wetland permitting people determine the wetlands that are most valuable to preserve, and those that might be more valuable through mitigation of preserving other areas that would ultimately have a higher functionality and purpose within the natural system. So I think that would hopefully address the question.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. So the last question, I'm going to queue it up exactly for Matt to kick off his place type, because it's a perfect question. It says, in which areas of the Southwest areas do we see the mixed use land potential? It really brings value to the area and profit to the local business. So Matt, there's your cue to really talk to that as you go into the next segment.
And we'll see the targeted sector a whole bunch, which is related to that. So let's look at place types, and it's great. You know, a lot of questions on sectors in these market area meetings have wanted for explanations of the place types. We just wanted to break it up so that we're sure that there's, you know, some more direct understanding of sectors first, and then onto the place types. So some place types are of a greater density intensity, and others are of a lesser density intensity. And the targeted sector, for instance, encourages infill growth, and it permits place types of that higher intensity than the established sector, which aims to maintain character, permitting place types of a lower intensity. But place types, they're not only about density and intensity. A lot of times future land use really focuses on that. I mean, that's what's required. But place types in Vision 2050 also determine how growth can occur through physical characteristics, of course, like building heights, but also block structure, civic spaces, so you don't just get open space along the edges, but you get meaningful full places for people to gather, mixture of uses, along with density intensity. Many place type details are regulated in the zoning code update Orange Code. And so we'll discuss that the next time around. They're really tightly connected to each other. In the comprehensive plan, place types are the new future land use, and they regulate the density and mix of uses, the mix of zones from the zoning code, and describe the intended character of new development and also of existing places. The place types are organized into 4 categories. The urban place types are applicable within the urban service area, the rural place types within the rural service area. There's open space place types that cover natural areas and parks, and then the special place types, which are similar to that special sector, areas that need special rules or consideration, like universities, industrial districts, theme parks, airports. As we've discussed, the sector is broad, and then there's different types within them. So we'll go through this in terms of simplicity. Open space types are the simplest. There's 2 types here, parks and recreation and natural areas. Both of those could be in any of the sectors. And I just want to point out on the right-hand side, we have these dials. These are intended to be able to compare, if you want to look at this, from one place type category to another in terms of the relative access to transportation, the relative density, and the relative preservation of landscape. Parks and Recreation covers the larger county parks and recreation facilities. Again, these are in any sector. They are intended to obviously enhance the surrounding area, and they tend to be located, the parks and rec spaces near built-up places versus the natural areas, which are places set aside for conservation. The preservation sector, of course, is full of natural areas, but again, they're also found in other sectors. So it may be mapped with established or mapped with targeted, but if it's an area that should be preserved in a natural condition, then there's a natural areas place type to mark that. So I'll also touch on the special types. These are hopefully simple in concept. And just like the special sector, they don't fit into the urban or rural categories necessarily, but they're key components of Orange County. So these places have special rules or they need special consideration. And 3 examples are industrial areas, institutions, and places of entertainment, like the theme parks. And there's other examples like airports and utility facilities as well. So the next 2 types are a little more complicated. The rural place types are simpler than the urban. So we'll look at these. We dove into the detail on the rural place types more this last meeting in the rural East Market area, and we'll also do that today, since a third of the market area is mapped rural, and conveniently there was a question about rural areas as well. So rural types are divided into 3 categories within the rural sector. These are all low density or very low density, low or no growth, with landscape and regional character preservation as a primary goal. So rural lands and rural settlements are things that we should be familiar with. We'll look at those. And then at last, we'll look at the place type on the top of the list, which is a proposal for consideration. And we'll explain it in greater detail than the others, because we want you to understand and think about whether you all think it's a good idea or not as we go forward to putting Vision 2050 together. So in reverse order, rural lands are those areas that we think of when we consider the rural environment. They have little or no development. They're principally agricultural or pastoral. This is what people tend to have in mind when you say rural. And these places are currently extremely limited from a growth perspective. The next type are the rural settlements, existing developed areas within the rural landscape, and these are generally intended for preservation of current character, not for growth or for expansion. So now let's look at the third type, the rural villages and hamlets. These are walkable places within the rural landscape, surrounded by land in rural use or by natural areas. Today, these don't exist, or the ones that have existed in the past have been built around. You know, we could say that some decades, you know, far in the past, that Windermere may have been like this before growth occurred around it. And so these areas are proposed as a potential solution in the whole growth and no growth struggle. Rural villages and hamlets, they would allow some growth with very strict rules to preserve the rural character. At present, there's a strong no growth stance in general, but the position changes over time. And in the future, large property owners will continue to ask for entitlements and exceptions to the growth rules. So the rural hamlets and villages option is a proposal that provides an avenue for very slow and limited growth. And so that when entitlements are pursued, as inevitably they will be, that there are a set of strict rules to engage with, rather than just an open-ended negotiation that could result in growth that's out of character with the rural landscape. So this may or may not be accepted as part of Vision 2050, but we wanted to consider this trade-off of where strict rules could be set now ahead of time to preserve rural character in the future. So the current proposal is aimed at managing a small amount of growth without sacrificing the overall rural character. Prior attempts at clustering in the county haven't worked out that well. And so instead you've ended up with basically just more quarter-acre housing subdivisions within a rural landscape, expanding the urban growth into the rural environment. And that doesn't fit, of course. And rural environments aren't simply about large 10-acre properties either. You know, that is neither rural. And for comparison, in Miami, the county had divided nearly all the redlands into 10-acre properties, and the rural character there was lost as well. So the rural environment really is defined by wide pastoral areas that are unbuilt. The hamlet and village proposals suggest that a very large minimum property size be required just to begin with, and that then only 20% of that property may be built upon. The remaining property would be either preserved in a conservation easement or is zoned with one of the new zoning codes of rural zones at a higher minimum lot size, like 25 acres. Inside of the 20% developed area, higher intensities would be allowed, but with strict standards that are aimed at absorbing growth while preserving open land. Now, we've written rules like this elsewhere. You know, a lot outside of the country, but some elsewhere in the US. And we've learned a lot from places like Scotland and England, where rural environments have long been preserved. And we've studied the potential trade-offs in Orange County, strict rules to preserve future rural character. The image in the background here shows a collection of English villages and hamlets, and between them, there's large areas of rural land that are preserved. So the hamlet as a type is the smaller of these two, proposed at 300 acres or larger, and again, restricting development to 20% of the total land area and preserving a minimum of 70% around it. But also that hamlets, if accepted, be located a minimum spacing away from roadways so that the rural character along county routes would be retained. Now the village is the larger of the two types, requiring at least twice the land, 600 acres as proposed currently. Unfortunately, with the drawing, we didn't have time to redraw it, but the drawing only shows a 300-acre site, so the actual area would need to be twice as large. What happened is we drew this and we found that no, if the village site was at 300 acres, that's currently not enough preservation. So being a proposal, these types of standards are fluid at the moment as we move towards Vision 2050. So like the hamlet, the village is only 20% potentially developed, 70% in rural reserve or preserve. So if it was a 600-acre site, that's 420 acres remaining rural into the future. So a little bit more development would be permitted in terms of the number of units in a village, but requiring a larger land area. And because the village as a type could provide some useful services to others that are living in the rural environment, they may touch the roadway but not occupy the entire edge. So, a proposal. So this type of development of, you say, well, that's theoretical, but we're building villages and hamlets in Scotland and England right now. It's really about the rules that are selected. And right now, ahead of future development, there's a time to select what the right rules are rather than reacting in the future to proposals. But the formative development like this isn't just foreign. There's rural areas in the U.S. that have seen compact development preserving rural lands and natural environments. So again, this proposal's aimed at preserving large areas of the rural environment while permitting a small amount of careful growth, in both cases limiting the development to only 20% of very large sites. And of course, such a proposal would need to determine viable means of utilities, but if desired, it's one potential way to preserve character in the face of growth pressure. So today, you may hold a line, but in the future, this is one way to preserve that sort of rural environment between. And we don't have yesterday we showed a good picture that was an example of this, and we don't have an example for the Southwest, but there is an example in the rural East if you want to view that video from yesterday. So now on to the urban place types. These types are the more complex of the place types, so you save them for last. The urban place types are further divided into three categories, more categories, but this is the last set of them. There's centers, there's corridors, and then there's neighborhood fabric. Each of those categories has 3 types in them, so there's 9 of these place types. So that may seem like a lot, but if you compare that to normal future land use categories, this is much more structured and simple and organized. And the goal here is to be better at communicating the vision for the future and expectations for residents of what they will see around them, and for developers of what's expected of them in the work that they do. Centers of these types are the most intense. They're all mixed use at the higher end of density relative to the other place types. Corridors connect centers to each other. These are mixed use, but at a lower density and intensity than centers. And the neighborhood fabric surrounds centers and corridors, and that's generally residential in use with supportive services like schools sort of embedded in neighborhood fabric. So here's a typical diagram to illustrate this structure. The centers highlighted here are typically located at the intersection of major roads. They're intended to be mixed use and vibrant places in the future for higher density and the convergence of different mobility options, as well as being places for jobs and entertainment. Today, these are mostly shopping centers, mostly along major roads, but they would be encouraged to infill with housing and additional non-residential uses along with civic space, so that together they're more vibrant as places. So the lowest intensity of the center is the neighborhood center. These are small, either mixed use or non-residential areas that may span just a few blocks, or smaller areas of mixed use where it's really important to preserve the compatibility with adjacent neighborhood fabric, to not be too out of scale. So the current single-use centers may be supplemented with additional housing, but growth in neighborhood centers is not necessarily that significant of an intensification as compared to the other types. So here the goal is compatibility in scale and activity with the surrounding neighborhood fabric. The urban and regional centers, these are the more intense place types that you may normally think of when we say mixed use center. Urban centers are the lower intensity of the two, urban and regional. And they have buildings of, say, around 4 stories on a connected grid of streets that mix non-residential and residential uses, entertainment, services, they're job centers. And these are some of these types of places that don't exist today in any quantity in the county, but there's a growing demand for people who want to live in that type of environment. Now, the other type is the regional center. We don't have a different image for it, but regional centers are more intense, you can say akin to downtown. and a regional center is planned for iDrive to become the key destination for the region. And these centers concentrate density and intensity to build vibrancy. They're also key nodes in future transportation on a future network. That's the type of development that transit needs to be efficient. You need to be able to stop and access from one stop lots of services, lots of jobs, and lots of population. And when you have stops that have that sort of activity strung along on a corridor, then transit can be cost effective, not only for the people riding it, but also for the transit operator. And these are also environments where different mobility solutions and micromobility work out well. You know, you can bike, you can walk, you can scoot, and you can roll in these types of environments, which is very difficult to do that in other places where you don't have concentrated activity. So corridors connect the centers to each other. They're generally along transportation routes, providing housing and business with transit access. Corridors are generally mixed use, typically today adding residential uses to areas that are already commercial, but their intensity and density is much lower than that of centers. And because they're generally adjacent to neighborhood fabric, corridors must transition in intensity towards surrounding neighborhoods. Main Street corridors, these are the lowest intensity of the corridor types. They're low in scale. They may be single-use corridors today and transition to low-intensity mixed use in the future. These corridors can really benefit from a focus on streetscape and streetscape improvements like these young trees here, or a bike rack for that bike that's unfortunately locked up to a tree, along with a code that really is encouraging these places and these types of businesses and buildings to flourish. And we're looking at that a lot in Orange Code. The Main Street corridors are areas where the treatment of the street itself requires particular attention. And as we mentioned, the connection in the comprehensive plan is a key component to indicate to the Florida DOT that this future land use is aimed to be walkable and bikeable. Same thing as the centers, which is a key approach to the context-sensitive standards. And those are really built in between these place types and Orange Code and the Department of Transportation standards. The transit corridors are the next type. These are located along existing and future transit routes. And because they have greater transit access, they're intended to be higher density intensity, probably not as big as this image. I didn't have a good one, you know, it's a little bit lower than those buildings. But really it's about connecting people with access to high quality transit. They're mixed use, but they may not necessarily be that commercial. And a lot of times in transit corridors, you can't sustain quality commercial business for forever and ever and ever. So a lot of these corridors would most likely be primarily residential along the way, with like little nodes of mixed use along them. Now, the goal here, of course, is to increase the population living along premium transit routes, to increase ridership and reduce some of the future traffic impacts that are associated with population growth. And then there's suburban corridors. These are located along major arterials that will remain car dependent. The suburban corridors may be intensified with some mixed uses, encouraged to be beautified, but the relationship to the major street requires special consideration with respect to zoning and land use. So without on-street parking here, for example, you can't really have these buildings right up to the street, but something like is drawn, shown here in the image is becoming increasingly common. So the remaining urban place types, the next three, are neighborhood fabric, and that makes up nearly all the established sector, but also a lot of the targeted sector. Neighborhood fabric is principally residential along with some supportive services. The lowest intensity neighborhood fabric is suburban neighborhood fabric. This is generally located in the established sector and covers nearly all of the established sector. It's a pretty common type, and the goals here are to generally retain the existing character of existing neighborhoods in the county. Now, suburban neighborhood fabric is entirely single-family residential, but also may include schools and religious facilities, clubhouses, and other things that are parts of those neighborhoods. Next is the suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. Also, this is generally in the established sector, and these are areas where, today there's single-family townhomes, multifamily housing that are kind of mixed together. And like the prior type, these are targeted generally for preservation of character, This type in particular, though, supports some missing middle housing types in a small amount of infill. And these are key to some of the naturally affordable housing opportunities that are part of the mayor's initiatives on affordable housing. Suburban mixed neighborhood fabric is found where these types mix in close proximity today, and also in some areas as a buffer between the higher intensity centers and corridors and the suburban fabric beyond. Now, the last place type is the traditional neighborhood fabric. This is the highest intensity of the neighborhood fabrics. It's still not nearly as intense as a corridor or a center. These areas mix different housing types together in a tapestry of walkable blocks and streets and open spaces. And so traditional neighborhood fabric, it does include schools and those similar uses like others, but also some small retail uses like corner stores and cafes, which have a small footprint. The principal goal of the traditional neighborhood fabric, though, is to provide a wide range of housing options in a walkable structure of blocks to increase housing affordability and also be located near to centers and corridors where there's access to jobs, entertainment, services, and transportation. Traditional neighborhood fabric is generally recommended everywhere in the targeted sector where it's not part of a center or corridor. So here's how they fit together into the sectors. The natural areas and parks and rec can happen really anywhere, but the other place types are generally limited according to sector, ideally controlling the intensity of development as well as its character. The overall goal is to intensify the targeted sector, which is almost entirely through redeveloping commercial properties on major roads, and then retaining the existing character elsewhere, which doesn't mean no growth, but instead limited growth at a low volume or slow pace. So, we went through all the types, and now, let's look at how a few places map out. Now, the first one's not in this market area, but it's a very clear example that demonstrates the urban place type categories of center, corridor, and neighborhood fabric as we saw in those diagrams. This example is used broadly just because it's clear and it demonstrates the intent of urban place types. So here is in the Northwest sector or Northwest market area. This is where Semerin connects with OBT. Some of this area is incorporated, and we'll look at how incorporated and unincorporated works out of this as well. But for the moment, we'll look at this diagrammatically, not taking out the incorporated areas. So this area is also useful because it demonstrates common characteristics, such as automobile-oriented commercial uses along the larger roads along Semerin and OBT, along with larger shopping centers at major intersections. And then beyond the commercial properties, there's a wide range of housing, large and small lot single family, some townhouses, some multifamily. So here's a map of the sectors when we zoom in to this scale. And it's pretty simple. Most of the properties in the area are in the established sector, and the targeted sector is mapped along the major roadways. And there's also a small node up on Thompson that you see, a small commercial node that we'll see as a neighborhood center. So here's a look at the boundary. If you can see it in the thicker black outline is the sort of targeted sector boundary between targeted and established sectors. And the targeted sector follows mostly the commercial properties on major roadways, and the single family neighborhoods beyond are generally in the established sector. Here's the map of place types for the area. Again, having the outline of the targeted sector here. Within the targeted sector, there's the higher growth types, centers, corridors, and traditional neighborhood fabric. In the established sector are the low growth types, suburban and the suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. These are the centers. Two of these centers were categorized as urban centers. These are areas of commercial and multifamily that are large enough to develop a structure of blocks. You can add more streets in there, and also civic spaces. And they can accommodate mixed use and higher intensity residential infill. They're in the targeted sector, of course. And the neighborhood center up to the north on Thompson is much smaller. And so this can accommodate a small amount of mixed use infill, but really the compatibility with the surrounding neighborhoods is key. So it's mapped as a neighborhood center. Here are the corridors. They're commercial and multifamily properties that are located along major roadways, again, Semerin and OBT here, but they're not included in the centers. So they connect the centers, they're in between. In this case, Because Summer and OBT are planned for future transit improvements, the corridors are transit corridors versus suburban corridors or Main Street corridors. The transit corridors encourage more residential and mixed-use infill than the other two types. And so the remaining area is all neighborhood fabric, the majority of the properties. And it's divided into suburban fabric in the light yellow, suburban mixed in the light orange, and traditional in the dark orange. They're differentiated, of course, by density and intensity, where the suburban fabric is the lowest density and the traditional neighborhood fabric is the higher of the three, all lower than corridors and centers. So when we look back at the place type map, and we can see how this area demonstrates the centers and corridors framework discussed earlier. This framework is also important as we encourage more efficient transit functionality. As I mentioned, having the nodes and the connections between the nodes to increase ridership, lend energy to the transit systems, and also make them function more efficiently. But here's what the map looks like when we add the incorporated areas. It's much more difficult to discern the pattern. The sector and place type mapping is designed with consideration for the incorporated areas and the types of land uses that are there today. But then we have to remove them from the sort of policy because the county policy doesn't apply there. Of course, those are places that the county and municipalities need to coordinate into the future. So, this is intended to demonstrate in general the concept, and now we'll look at a couple examples in the Southwest. So here's one Southwest market area example, around Windermere, Conroy Road, and Apopka, Vinland Road. This particular one's a little complicated because it includes this odd situation that you have in the Southwest where rural settlements have been surrounded by more urban development. And we'll look a little at the overlap between, established and rural, which may or may not be adjusted. We'll see as the maps go forward for public review. And in the initial mapping here, we also found a number of things that need to be corrected. I'm going to include the version to point out the corrections as an example of the work being done over the next couple months to verify the maps, and then a corrected map sort of at the end of this set of slides. Those maps in a couple months will be put on the Vision 2050 website and available for public review. So here's the first sector map of the area. Due to the existing settlement patterns, the targeted sector is spotty. In some cases it's long along corridors, but in this case, because of the single family coming all the way up to Conroy and so many areas, there's these little pieces of targeted sector along the way. So it doesn't follow the roadway as you might expect otherwise. And then there's some other things here that we noticed, like Shadow Bay Park shows up as part of the preserve sector, but Bill Frederick Park shows as established, and they're kind of switched in a way. These are the types of adjustments we'll be making to the maps. At first you do a translation from existing to future, and then sort of we're tweaking the standards to create a map as accurate as possible. But let's look at this initial mapping. Here over the aerial are the targeted sectors called out with the red outline. They vary greatly in size, and they're isolated from a larger framework of corridors. And so compatibility with the existing adjacent areas is especially important here for targeted sector infill. So here are also the boundaries of the rural settlements for reference, since this area has the mixture between the two. So here's the place type map. It's also a bit odd as compared to the next one we'll look at, or the prior. And so we'll look at that in detail. But like elsewhere, the more intensive place types are limited to the targeted sector, with the exception of a transit corridor type. Though given the context, these may be more appropriate. Those corridors may be more appropriate for a Main Street corridor or a suburban corridor than transit. And at the edge, we also noticed that the edge of Shadow Bay Park here probably shouldn't have a corridor mapping. That's the park. And this is why the mapping will take a little while to share as we work these things out and zoom into areas, especially in the Southwest, where you have a lot of interesting conditions. So here's the centers isolated. And both of these are mapped as neighborhood centers because the compatibility with adjacent neighborhood fabric here is especially important. Then here are the corridors. And as I said, they're mapped as transit corridors. But further investigation is required, and some of these need to be adjusted. And I'll show an example of these adjusted at the end. Like for example, the lower part of the wetlands next to Hutchinson Morley Road is, doesn't need to be a corridor. But the special place types are a little more clear. These are mostly educational, like the high school, but also institutional, like St. Luke's. And these smaller places like elementary schools may be part of the established place type as they're in the neighborhood, but things like high schools are generally between neighborhoods, so they're mapped out independently. So here's open space. These are parks and recreation, at Shadow Bay and Bill Frederick Parks. And then neighborhood fabric, almost entirely suburban fabric. And I saw that this was a little odd that some of the suburban fabric was mapped inside of the rural settlement because of the lot sizes. Like those lot sizes were more in line with suburban fabric standards than with the rural settlement. So those require adjustment as we've done in the map. And then here are the rural settlements overall. And so when you combine them together and call out the types, this is what a place type map would look like. The incorporated areas are also identified at the edges here. So the area like this, and I think especially the Southwest, requires some close attention to the maps because you have a lot of these things going on. But this being the last of these 6 market area meetings around the subject matter, the county's team and the consultants team have learned a lot from sharing maps, taking questions, and talking about these types that are going to help us in the mapping process in the next coming months. So here is a corrected map. I'm not calling everything out, but we remove the corridors from the special place types, though a couple of corridors may still need investigation. We changed the corridor at Conroy and Hiawassee to Main Street rather than transit, as that's more appropriate for that type, and adjusted the types within the rural settlements for consistency. And there were a few other minor adjustments to match real conditions on the ground. But if we stand back, we know that the red areas, these are centers, and then there's corridors where they can be along the major roads and neighborhood fabrics there around them. So looking at another example, this one's simpler, but here we're talking about new growth, future growth. And so this is just below the iDrive Future Regional Center between Lake Bryan and Shingle Creek. Here the county owns a large area along iDrive next to some historically platted lots. Some of those are developable, others are in areas that really should have been preserved. So here's a sector map for the area. Most of it's in the targeted sector as part of the iDrive and the I-4 corridors, where much of the future growth is aimed. And at the right side of the map is the preserve sector. This is identifying areas to be preserved as part of the Shingle Creek system. Over the area, here's the targeted sector called out. It's pretty simple, but we did discuss that there are other policies in addition to this, such as any development towards the right-hand side is obviously going to have to deal with preservation of wetlands, preservation of natural habitats, and so forth. But that's outside of the scale of the sectors. That's in the scale of development. So here's a place type map within the targeted sector line, as indicated here. You see the more intense future land use categories of centers, the transit corridor along iDrive and 535, and traditional neighborhood fabric. We'll look at the place types in a moment. We'll call them out individually. But in this case, there's a deep yellow, the sort of, or the light orange that's within the targeted sector line. Now, this is a suburban mixed neighborhood. The purpose here, this is one of these things where we say, well, this should be in the established sector, but sometimes it occurs in the targeted. And when you have this sort of difference to point out, it's really important to think like, well, why is this potentially out of place? Well, there's a reason. The purpose here is to decrease future development intensity as it gets further away from I-Drive and closer to the preserved sector. And so while, of course, suburban neighborhood fabric would be less intense and could be applied here, that doesn't really provide much opportunity for naturally occurring affordable housing types, the missing middle. And those are part of the suburban mixed neighborhood fabric and the traditional fabric. And so I wanted to point this out as a place where something may not fit the guidance of sectors exactly, but it's mapped for a reason, has changed from that typical standard for a reason. So looking at the types, here's a center identified in the study area. This is on undeveloped land. The wider area of the targeted sector is mostly traditional neighborhood fabric. So a more intensive center, an urban center, is more compatible with this type. A traditional neighborhood fabric, the neighborhood center is fine, but it can actually handle urban centers as part of that, and that'll help with the sort of intensity of activity in the area. There are also other areas here in the image that may work as additional centers. For instance, the hotel cluster by I-4 and 535, but at the moment it's mapped as traditional neighborhood and also corridor. So here are the corridors, this time, appropriately transit corridors. And as you can see on 535, the transit corridors mapped about 200 to 500 feet from the roadway to encourage densification along the road. And then, which is coordinating that land use and transportation. And then from there, it moves on to traditional neighborhood fabric. There's a special place type here, the Sunshine Elementary School, and then the neighborhood fabric. It's almost all traditional neighborhood fabric, but of course, there's a bit of suburban mixed neighborhood fabric towards the preserved areas at Shingle Creek. And of course, you're not building over Lake Bryan, you're not building over these wetlands, but they're mapped in this fabric type, and there's other policies to preserve those areas, either in the comprehensive plan or in the zoning code. And so here are the types combined, composite place type map, and the incorporated area here is also identified in the dark hatch on the left-hand side. It's a pretty simple map, but hopefully also clear in terms of locating an urban center. This one's not at a major intersection, but you'd see another urban center at the next major intersection. They need to occur on a regular basis to encourage people and to provide places for people to access services without always having to drive, reducing some trips, maybe not all trips, but some trips. So we have these centers and the transit corridors, and then we step down in intensity to the traditional neighborhood fabric, and then the suburban mixed neighborhood fabric before the natural areas that are beyond that. So that was a lot of ground in growth management policy, but the goal here in these meetings is to share information about the comprehensive plan concepts of sectors and place types, so that you're able to really interpret the maps that are released for review, and you can ultimately better provide feedback and better interact with the comprehensive plan in the future. And so we'll leave this graphic up, which correlates the place types and sectors that they're intended for. And we'll go to some questions and discussion with Maria.
Thank you, Matt. That was quite a lot of information for people to absorb, but hopefully it did answer the last two questions I spoke to, which was where are mixed uses permitted and encouraged, and where's the population density going to go? And you showed that along the corridors and the centers. So I'm going to direct this question to Alberto because it is a little bit of a place-specific one related to Horizon West. Alberto, it says, what about those areas surrounded and directly negatively impacted by the Horizon West's development? Are there plans to protect and heal the rural areas? Less than 30 years ago, there was a regulation in place to allow only one house per acre in this area. How can we trust the regulations will not be amended to appeal to developers without Florida's best interest at heart? It seems as a priority for development rather than listening to the concerns and protections desired of current residents. So, this is a usual question that we hear a lot, which is, how do we know that this plan is going to be enforceable?
Sure. So thank you for, again, the question, Marina. Horizon West and its environs, that includes the surrounding character of development that abuts the densities that are associated to each one of the villages. As addressed before, the transitions that happen between the villages and some established neighborhoods within the surrounding areas of Horizon West are addressed by compatibility in terms of what happens in the areas that are preserved, the transition areas, as well as some of the historical neighborhoods. And some of those include rural settlements. One specific in that area is Lake Avalon Rural Settlement, which was originally included as part of the visioning of the first sector plan in the county, the first sector plan in the state of Florida, which is Horizon West. And by the request of those residents that live there, it was carved out. So at the scale of that particular rural settlement, which is less intense than the majority of the rural settlements in the county, if the standard is one dwelling unit per acre, you can see that within the Avalon, with Lake Avalon rural settlement, the densities gravitate between 1 dwelling unit per 5 acres to 1 dwelling unit per 2 acres. So it's less intense than the majority of the rural settlements. And Vision 2050 is committed to, at this particular time, to continue to preserve and guarantee the preservation of the character of those rural settlements, of all of them, all 22 of them in the county. We explicitly identified each one of the rural settlements as a place type, if you would, carrying their character, their scale, and overall experience of the community as it stands today, with all the existing policies in the comp plan that allow for incremental change as per each one of those policies. Now, it is important also to mention that as Horizon West continued to develop over time incrementally, and with the level of activity that it has, it is almost impossible to mitigate all of the different levels of impacts that may affect some of those established neighborhoods, including traffic, of course, and other implications that growth may bring with it. But as a sector plan, as a village, and the policies for Horizon West, it is already very predictable, entitled as part of this presentation already stated. So that is Lake Avalon rural settlement, one specific one with a very unique character of development, and the policies will continue to protect the integrity of that. There's another type of development that surrounds Horizon West that was very carefully analyzed by many different months of engagement with the residents as well, and that is the rural residential enclaves, which are different than rural settlements. The rural residential enclave that's adjacent to Horizon West is Lake Mabel, which is one of the 4 rural residential enclaves that were studied in the county. Some of them are within the urban service area, some of them are outside, but the rural residential enclaves all belong within the urban service area. And in the case of Lake Mabel, is minimum of 1 acre per unit, which is pretty consistent to the character of that area. The intent there is also to preserve the overall development pattern of those communities that are established and are adjacent to Horizon West, to continue to preserve that historical, physical, environmental, and with a specific set of policies of development even within those areas that are within the residential enclaves and could potentially infill within it. So there's a level of predictability there. So you can see that these communities, one a rural settlement, the other one rural residential enclave, are extremely focused in terms of preservation of their character and the levels of predictability that Vision 2050 will continue to carry.
Thank you. And I think That was well described, and somebody asked a question yesterday, which we can piggyback onto this, which is, and I think this it speaks to the importance of place types, which is if there's a developer who, like within Horizon West, that is in the intended sector, and they're abutting a rural place type, they will not be able to encroach into that area anymore and just say, I want to include this in my development. Right? Right.
That is correct. That is correct. Yeah, the rural settlements have a very, very defined boundary area, and so does the residential enclaves. And there are maps in the comprehensive plan today, in the map series, that define those specific boundaries for the rural residential enclaves as well.
Okay, great. So since we're on the topic of rural, the place types allowed in the rural sector, two other questions I'll direct to Matt a little bit, and they are implying the same, which is some people want to see more growth, and some people are saying we shouldn't be preserving this much, and it seems that hamlets and villages are locking in the growth. On the other hand, someone else is saying that the rural village development will only be affordable to the upper middle class or wealthy individuals. So what about affordable housing? So maybe, Matt, you can speak to the different building types that are permitted within each of the different the rural place types at this stage.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's some accuracy of course if you're talking about new development and in an area outside of the center that they tend to be more expensive, but that also tends to happen because you are limiting the number of units that can be built, and you're limiting the type of housing that can be built in those areas. So most of the development that you've seen that's been new in rural areas has essentially been medium lot size single family and restricted in terms of the number of units. So the way to sort of flip that on its head is to allow for a greater diversity and encourage a greater diversity of unit types. So you're not just building, all quarter acre, half acre, single family properties in that environment, but instead that you're encouraging for a small node of mixed use. You're encouraging for some degree of multifamily housing, of townhomes and duplexes, of cottage courts, small single family homes, as well as some medium and larger homes. So that mixture of things. And one way that you do that is by limiting the development footprint, but allowing a certain development capacity, a certain number of units that when you put them in that footprint together, you can't achieve that all with quarter acre lots. And so you're you're either going to diversify the housing types, or you're leaving a lot of development capacity on the table. And so as much as is possible, that's why you would say restrict the footprint, but up the number of units over a sort of quarter acre development, so that you are able to get multifamily housing and townhomes and other housing types that are smaller in footprint, smaller in land area, and therefore more cost efficient.
And it's also acknowledging the fact that there are people who want to live in the rural settlements that don't necessarily want to have a house on 4 acres or 5 acres or 10 acres, but it's a very limited number.
And just to add to that, again, it just goes back to the premise of the acknowledged facts of that we currently are the current times in Orange County, in terms of the crisis of affordability, in terms of access to residential units that are affordable to many different households. Whether you are a young professional or anybody who's working in the service industry, and older couples that are also in retirement mode, there's a different need for different households in the county, and it's been widely recognized not only at a county level but at a regional level. We have created a very specific action plan to look at the next 10 years with very strategic recommendations that address regulatory modifications to our existing code, and they're transferable to Orange Code, and tools as well that lets us better understand the development that's coming and rank the placement of that development against an accessibility and opportunity model that helps us identify different indicators of planned corridors based on in terms of transit and services and housing conditions within those particular areas. So you have the socioeconomic aspect, and then as well as the other indicators that identifies the conditions of those sites. Most of that is very consistent with the targeted sector as described today. So when we look at, if we were to turn on all the indicators in the accessibility and opportunity model, the entire targeted sector lights up as areas that may be suitable for incentives that are either regulatory or financial incentives for the inclusion of affordable and attainable type of housing product types.
And I think it's very important to say that when we speak about affordable, we don't mean necessarily of the one building type that people are used to seeing, but it's really that missing middle that Matt was describing, which are the duplexes, the townhouses, the triplexes, the fourplexes, so on and so forth, so that you encourage a variety of people living together within a certain proximity. It seems to me, Alberto, that there are really very more clearly here than in any of the other market areas, two very specific and different groups of people, so that there are obviously those who are really enjoying living in the rural settlements and see the value of that lifestyle. And there are also those who are not interested in necessarily preserving the pattern of the past, but really see this area as an opportunity to unlock more jobs, more housing options, and greater diversity. I would hope that this presentation today really showed how both are possible by identifying those areas that, and that's why we have the sectors that identify the slow growth, the medium growth, and the more aggressive growth, and why we also have places like Horizon West, which will continue to sort of evolve. I don't know if either Matt or Alberto.
Well, yeah, it was super interesting that it's like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 when you broke it up, you know, and unlike other places, the Southwest Market area has more different opportunities for different types of lifestyle. And of course, you know, today what's in the targeted sector doesn't really achieve those goals of the more urban lifestyle and job center, but that's it's exactly what is being designed through sectors, through place types, through the iDrive plans to create those opportunities. But then at the same time, the reason why we have sectors is to preserve the other lifestyles that are desired. So, you know, a lot of times we say there are a lot of options, and, you know, it's not that you're right and you're wrong, or you're right and you're wrong. It's just that you may like different things, and they can be accommodated in different places, and we can do so while absorbing growth in a way that is more sustainable.
Yeah, there are people here writing in support of the rural settlements. That's actually quite clear. The last question is somewhat of an interesting one too, and we really haven't touched upon this. Someone is asking, while Horizon West is already planned out, can you please cite specific examples within it that correlate to the different urban service area types or the place types? And I think maybe it's worth Alberto speaking a little bit to the fact that these places like Horizon West are already permitted under, you know, a previous development approval. So while they will have areas of intensification as well, they may not look exactly like the place types that Matt is describing for future development.
Yeah, so one specific community that is fairly consistent with the development of traditional neighborhoods and centers and some suburban neighborhoods as well. And the corridors that we're describing is Silverleaf, where you have a regulating plan, you have transit zones in terms that basically regulate the type of development and the transitions that happen in between the densities and intensities of the community itself. You have areas that are designated to be mixed use. You have areas that are transitioning between that higher density into the single family detached with very well incorporated natural systems, open spaces within the community itself, and amenitized open spaces as well, and then single family detached. So that's a very interesting microcosm or assumed in community that begins to offer that. Also the Hamlin community, I think that it over time incrementally continues to build itself into a diverse neighborhood center that offers a lot of different services with some mixed use integration as well in the town center village. So I think that those are pretty good examples that are a little bit more complete in terms of communities, which is what we're striving for, whether they happen to be in a established sector, which is the case of Horizon West, or other established areas outside the urban service areas, such as the Lake Pickets, or others that are within the urban service area because of expansion of the line, which is Sunbridge as well. They carry the intent of the complete communities. And when we speak of affordable housing, they also carry the policies of developing and integrating different product types within their communities for all the mentioned purposes.
Thank you. Thanks, Alberto. That was the last question I had. It is 7:57, so we have 3 more minutes. I don't know if you want to have any closing remarks since this sort of wraps up series 2, or if Matt has any final thoughts or comments, or anyone else for that matter.
I'll just like to thank everybody again for their time, valuable time spent with us tonight. I think there were some very good questions and concerns that we will continue to incorporate into the planning process here. We will follow with a 3rd series of town hall meetings, and those are yet to be announced within the next couple of months. Here, we will, that bridges everything that you have experienced today from the sectors and more specific place types into Orange Code and how those place types are regulated with our new land development code update. So please stay tuned, continue to be involved through this process. And there's going to be also focus meetings with different stakeholders and organizations out there as follow-up in terms of different topics here. So there's quite a bit to go, quite a bit in front of us before we enter the different public hearings. So thank you for your time again.
And those on Zoom, there'll be a short feedback that you'll be able to fill in, and but also please go to the Vision 2050 website where you can access surveys and past meeting recordings as well.
Great. Thank you. With 1.5 minutes to spare, good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.